Eric Burgess here with Music Marketing TV, and today we are starting a series of sound design tutorials with DIVA. They will be application focused instead of every single button and knob focused, because that's just how sound designers think. No one thinks by looking at every knob and thinking, what does this knob do, and then designing a sound. No one does that. So we're going to be focusing application wise, hopefully give you a really solid foundation to work off of. And DIVA is a great starting synth. So if you've never done any sort of sound design, if this is your first synth, congratulations, it's an excellent synth. Today we're going to be doing sub-bass material. Here's a quick preview. All right, so I've whipped up something a little here for our preview. Here we go. Oh, and some sleigh bells to keep up with the holiday spirit. Got to add sleigh bells on everything during the end of November and the beginning of December, right? Oh, and here it is. So I'm going to show you how to make that and several other things in this video. All right, so you've heard a preview. I'm going to show you a couple distortion things along the way as well, because they kind of tie in nicely. And let's get started. So I like to start with sub-bass material in pretty much all my sound design courses, because it's an easily accomplishable goal. And it's a great way to just get familiar with the basics of the synth. So sub-bass material, a couple ways to do it. One is to just start with a wave that doesn't have a lot of higher harmonics, such as a sine wave, and just put that in the low end. And then we're going to mess with it with modulators. Another way is to take something that does have higher harmonics and use a filter to remove those higher harmonics, so we're only left with the low part of the signal. I'm using sub-bass a little loosely. Some of these things are just like regular bass kind of stuff. But, you know, things that are on the low side of the spectrum. We need to figure out how to get to the init preset. So DIVA is a little unusual right now compared to the other UHE synths, because if you right click up here, you don't get the option to go right to init. Instead, you get the big list, and init is all the way at the bottom. So they have a preset tab down here. If you go to this, we see in here we have a restore initialize. Now, we want to go to the user folder and click this button. And what it does is basically, this is an empty folder because there's nothing in it right now. And now when I right click, I get the init option. This is the only sort of unusual thing you sort of have to set up if you like the init thing being there. And you'll have to do this every time. So it doesn't make the most sense. Instead, they have over here these templates. And these are great starting points that they've already thought out. And if you make this your init point and you right click, or just regular click, my bad, no right click, we get these, and init is on the bottom. And so this is one that you may also just use. You're probably just going to come into this tab right now. One day in the future, I think they'll probably update it so that it works like Hive 2 does currently. But anyways, we're going to go to init just so we're all on the same page. Here we are, init. You should have a sound that sounds like this. Beautiful. And let's go ahead, let's dive into some of these settings. Now, first we have our sound generating things. These are our oscillators. We have digital oscillators and modeled oscillators. Technically, I guess they're all modeled, digitally modeled, but we also have analog modeled stuff, hence the names like VCO, which if you're unfamiliar, it's the voltage controlled oscillator. It's basically just a tip of the hat to the way the oscillator was coded and made. It was made to behave like an actual electronic oscillator. So we have a triple VCO, a dual VCO. We got a whole bunch. You actually don't need to click on the label either. You can just click anywhere down here and it will tell you the magic ways. So we have some digital stuff, and I want to turn your attention to the dual VCO. This is the one we're going to look at mostly in this tutorial. And the reason is they have a sine wave option. And as far as I could find in the synth, that's the only place the sine wave option really lives. So if you click on it, and turn this one off. So the way these ones work are, we have two oscillators. And we have the option on our mix knob here to put out them both together. So it's important to be able to know what's going to happen without having to push the note. That way you're in control of the creative process. So if I play a note right now, we're going to hear a mix of a saw wave and a sine wave. And because our mix is at 50%, it's mixed between the two. And we also hear a filter. We notice it's not as bright, and that's because the filter's right here. So we have a ladder filter, it's just a type of filter. And we'll just take the cutoff up so it doesn't do anything. And we can hear this. So we don't want this one. We can actually turn it off by just not having anything selected. Or if we have this on and we'd rather not have that, we can actually just turn the mix over to the second oscillator. You see the results the same. And what's cool about this is if in our creative process we want to mix between the two waves, maybe that's something we want to do, we can automate the mix in our DAW, and that's just a cool option we have. Of course, I don't really care that much about it. In fact, I'm going to use both methods. So 100% VCO2, and there you go. It is important to know which one you picked, because later on when you're messing with other settings, you're like, why isn't it working? And you notice, oh, you changed the mix and nothing happens. It could be this. So that's a really important in knowing why the behavior is the way it is. So we have our I almost said triangle wave, because it sounds kind of like a triangle wave. They actually have a scope, if you click down here. And the reason it sounds like a triangle wave, and in fact on the spectrogram up here, we can see extra stuff. And the reason is because we see it's been clipped a little bit. This is part of the modeling. And it's one of the reasons why DIVA sounds so dang good. So if we come in here, we actually have an ideal setting, which ironically still isn't ideal, but it's a lot more sine wavy. We have an analog 1 option and an analog 2 option. They're just different flavors. So we're already pretty close to sub-bass era material. Now what we need to do is we could just move our VCO down an octave or two. And we are in the low end, my friends. Now, if you're wearing headphones that are good, you should be able to hear that stuff. But if you can't hear it, or if you're listening over a phone, this is going to be a bit problematic. But there's our sub-bass stuff. So we figured it out. Now, we still need to identify some things. Where is our volume control coming from? Well, if we come over here, we see we have two envelopes. Now, if you're not familiar with an envelope, these turn things on and off over time. So an attack, decay, sustain, release. Attack determines how long it takes for it to turn on. So if you actually turn this value up, we see it fades in. So if you have a sound that's got clicks or pops at the beginning, hear that click, and you don't want that, you could just smooth it out. And now it's a more filtered click. And if we take it off completely, and so that is the attack. We also have decay and sustain, and decay can also act as a release. This is super important because right now you notice as soon as I stop playing, the sound stops. I'll play, let go. It immediately stops. But if we want to make a kick drum, which is what I kind of want to focus on here, we want this on. So we turn this on, and now when I hit the note once, just one tap, tap, it rings out for as long as the decay says. Now, an important note too is the sustain. If you hold down the note, it's going to sustain at whatever value this is. So you see it's sustaining, but if I actually have this at 0, it won't sustain at all, and it will immediately go basically to the release phase, which right now is rather long, but I'm holding the note down still. If we actually, let's make this shorter so it's a bit more clear. There you have it. So this is essentially how you would set up a gate, which is on, off. There's no sort of middle stuff. But for our kick drum, I'm going to leave the sustain down and use the release. And let's make it a bit shorter. And that is great. Now I'm going to maybe move this up to 16. Now, one thing that we have here is we have polyphony, which means we're able to play more than one note at a time, which is really great. But if we're making a kick drum, this could probably be problematic. And in a synth, it's really important to know where your voice options are. So if we come over here, let's go to our main tab. And this is true of like almost every synth ever. There's going to be stuff in here that deal with the note behavior. If we come over here, we see we have mode polyphonic. We don't want this. So we're going to make it. Now we have two options that are of our interest right now. We have mono and legato. It is important which one you pick. So if we pick legato, and we play notes, if the notes overlap while we're playing them, it's going to treat that as one envelope. So one envelope will be triggered. This is not what we want because the sound will die out as we play. Watch. He just goes away. Says, hey, I was doing stuff. I'm not done yet. So what we need to do is we need to select mono. It knows that it only wants one note, but it will generate a unique envelope for every note. And only one note will be played at a time, so we won't have to worry about envelopes overlapping with each other and causing all these waves to build up. All right, so we've got our basic thing going here. Now what we can do is we can add a filter. For example, say we want an even cleaner sine wave than even this. What we can do is we can bring our filter down. That's quite a bit cleaner. And what we now do is if I play higher notes though, it goes away. If our only interest is low end, then this isn't a problem. But we can actually use something called keyboard tracking, which will move the cutoff around as we play higher notes. The cutoff will move up, so the filter effect is still there, but it follows our keyboard around. So we're just going to turn that on all the way. You see as we play it higher though, it's still there. And if we remove this, the filter does no longer tracks with our keyboard, meaning it doesn't move around as we play higher notes. So that's industry, or I guess sound design speak. They call it tracking. It's keyboard tracking. And I really like that here. It adds a bit of versatility to the patch, so we're going to keep that. And there's another option in here that is pretty interesting. So, and this is where the distortion comes in. We have a cross modulation option. And what cross modulation means in basic terms right now is distortion. It's going to add harmonics and things to our sound. And that oftentimes is a pretty interesting thing to fiddle around with. And so this cross modulation, however, requires two oscillators to be active. So let's turn on our second oscillator. We're going to use the triangle wave. And now let's just bring our cross modulation up. And you can hear it doing its thing. Now I'm going to bring the attack down, so we get a bit more of a kick kind of a sound. And now you might be going, why don't you need to change the mix? Well, that's because it's cross modulation. In modulation, you don't hear directly. So we are hearing VCO's effect on VCO 1's effect, oscillator 1, on oscillator 2. Modulation is when one wave, the way it turns on and off some quality of another wave. And so we say in those cases that the first wave modulates the second wave. And modulation can be a confusing topic because the results are often very complex. But right now, you can just chalk it up to interesting things begin to happen. It's actually what a lot of people do, because it really helps simplify sort of what you're going for. And as you get better at sound design and learn more kinds of modulation and gain more experience, you will intuitively sort of know what to expect. There are ways to calculate the stuff, but that's going to be kind of overkill with what we want to achieve here. So I'm going to go with something like that. I'm also going to make it lower. And you can see that really changes the quality. All right, so I'm going to settle with this as our ending sound. But let's go ahead and make something with it real quick and also just dress it up a bit in post. We've got our core sound, and we can really begin to make it shine with additional distortion and maybe some stereo widening in the mixer afterwards. We could, of course, attempt to do stuff like this inside of DIVA, but I often find it really, really helpful to get your core sound out of your synth and then often use external stuff afterwards. Well, one thing that I do kind of want to screw around with here is feedback. Feedback is always an interesting parameter to sort of just screw around with. And so let's just real quick see if it does something that we kind of like. Well, it definitely rounds it out a bit. I think I'm going to leave the feedback off in this case. Let's go ahead and let's write something in real quick. All right, so I've whipped up something a little here for our preview. I know I didn't explain every sound design move I used here. I'm going to do a little bit more explaining after this to explain how I took our sound and actually sort of applied it. The beginning is sort of the sound by itself. It's this weird shifting sound, and then I bring stuff in, and you know, away you go. You can imagine some lyrics to go along with it. Here we go. Oh, and some sleigh bells to keep up with the holiday spirit. Gotta add sleigh bells on everything during the end of November and the beginning of December, right? Oh, and here it is. So I'm going to show you how to make that and several other things in this video. And for those of you at the end of the video, let's really quick talk about a couple things that I did here. I added obviously quite a few elements, and there is a vinyl strip on here which is making all that crackling noise. It's going to drive me insane. So let's see here. So there's a bit of a mix down. I am sort of cheating on the mix, and I pumped everything up because in post I've learned that this has just become a bit more of a nightmare. So I just threw a Pro L2 on there by FabFilter. But on the DIVA side of things for sound design, not a whole lot of crazy moves were made. A couple afterthought adjustments were made, and I found the changing of the octaves to get a ratio that was cool for the cross modulation was a really important thing to do. It really helped me find the tone that I wanted, and I experimented with different waveforms in the shape. Another really interesting thing, well, you might be going, what are you automating to get that weird movement? And that's actually the cross modulation. So if we play it and watch this. So that is the cross modulation at work doing its thing. Now there is some stuff in post, but I want to show you one other thing in here. Some filter settings were touched, but when you go to automate the cross modulation, so you see here there's this FM, and it's called FM. If we move it, we can see the cross modulation moves as well. And I thought this was a fascinating thing. I didn't dig into all the details, but kind of a cool side note there. Now we are, and if you're not familiar with FM, it stands for frequency modulation, which is a whole nother topic. But here I chose automation that would make sense musically, like with what I kind of wanted to do. So I knew I wanted a more stable tone and some sort of really wacky tone right before I came in. And then I needed to write drums and things so that they could help me lead into the next phrase. And so I thought this worked out really well. And this was a stable tone I found. So this was done by experimentation. In post, the only post I really want to show you is the DIVA channel. We've got a Nugent Stereoizer 3. I really like this. Mono compatible stereo expansion, of course, depending on how you set it up. And so I'm largely leaving off the low end anyways in my stereo expansion. So this is the filter axes. So when this plays, let's turn all the effects off. And now with the stereo expansion, you can hear how much wider that is. I really liked that a lot because it's just sort of this weird thing. So I wanted it to do that. Some distortion. This one's the Saturn by FabFilter. You could use a lot of things. Saturn's just got a really nice timbre to it. So without, just a little more dull. it emphasizes some of those mid harmonics. It adds content there, and that's why it just sounds a little more, some people would say, warm. And also a driver. This one's by Native Instruments, and it's really, really interesting to mess with the resonance and frequency knobs in tandem, and also the distortion. The disto knob also offers some interesting flavors of distortion. It's like bringing out the real forefront of the thing. And then finally, to top it all off, I've got an X, another stereo expander. This one is a dynamic stereo expander, so it changes with the dynamics of the signal, which makes it really cool. And there's also some various things in here, like the Haas effect is built in on a frequency basis and is also driven by stereo expansion. Same with the warp, which the warp can add those reverby kind of sounds. So really, really cool stereo expander at the end. And I mixed it in halfway because if at the end, what I would do is I'd siphon this into 2 buses. And on one, I'd have just the low end. On the other stuff, I would have all the stereo expansion, and I'd make sure that my low end below like 30 was all mono for sure. Maybe even as high as 40 or 50. Just make it mono, because over large systems, that could become a problem. But I'm not writing for something like that right now. And so I am a-okay with where we are. But yeah, after everything's been added and we put it all together, we get a really cool sort of shifting around sound that's really fun to be musical with. If you have any questions about this, let me know. Subscribe, hit that bell icon for future videos, and have a blessed day.